So I want to take a look back today at something that I didn't think I was going to be talking about for a while, and that has to do with the relationship between Sony and Nintendo and the real story behind why Nintendo quote-unquote betrayed Sony and announced a partnership with Philips CDI at the exact same event when Sony announced the Super Disc, which was the add-on to the Super Nintendo. And basically, that is when Sony went public with the partnership between them and Nintendo, and then literally the next day, Nintendo publicly betrayed them, which has given Nintendo a bad look and often led people to believe that this is what led to the creation of the PlayStation brand and ultimately, created one of the greatest rivalries in video game history, which before that was obviously Sega versus Nintendo. But the story is a lot more complicated than some people have you believe, because everybody knows the side of the story that there was a partnership between Sony and Nintendo backed out of that partnership and went with Philips, and some people think this is one of the greatest mistakes Nintendo has ever made. But there's a reason Nintendo did what they did, and Sony's not completely innocent, because the contract that was put in place was not necessarily made in good faith. And no, what Sony wanted to do would not have broken that contract. So, yes, Nintendo did not honor the contract between Sony and Nintendo. However, Nintendo did believe that it was not a good faith contract for a very good reason, because this contract could have potentially destroyed Nintendo, and if Nintendo didn't back out of it, they could have been in a lot of trouble. So let's actually go into the story. A lot of this comes from the book Replay the History of Video Games. I'll put an Amazon affiliate link to it down in the description if you would like to get it. It goes over a long, winding history of video games from the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s. It's a very, very good read, and I suggest anyone who's interested in the history of video games really check out that book. I think it's about $20. Now, here's what it says in here. This is an excerpt from it. It says, "It should have been a coup. On May 28, 1991, at the Consumer Electronics Show in Chicago, Sony proudly revealed that it was working with Nintendo to create a version of the Super NES with an inbuilt CD drive. The two Japanese companies have been working together in secret on the project, tentatively titled the Nintendo PlayStation, since 1989. With the hype about the CD-ROM reaching fever pitch, Sony's announcement should have been a highlight of the trade show. But behind the scenes, all was not well. Since agreeing to the alliance, Nintendo had become increasingly nervous about Sony's intentions, fearing that it wanted to use the project to muscle in on the games business. Nintendo's paranoia was justified. Ken Kutaragi, the Sony engineer who initiated the whole project, saw the partnership as the first step to achieving his dream of getting Sony to start making game consoles. Suspecting as much, Nintendo decided to strike first. The day after Sony gave its announcement, Nintendo announced it was dropping Sony and was now working with its Dutch rival, Philips, instead. Sony was shocked at the public humiliation Nintendo had inflicted on it, but if Nintendo had hoped to push Sony out of the games business, the move backfired. Obviously, from there, we kind of know the story. Nori Oga was furious, and he egged Kutaragi. They made a whole new Sony computer entertainment division and ended up releasing the PlayStation in the 90s. So we already know how the story went after that point. But what's lost in here is that there were some IP rights that were at the center of all of this. Basically, the way the contract was written up, Nintendo would be losing rights to a lot of their IPs in many facets, and Sony would be able to freely use those IPs in other mediums like movies and TV shows and stuff like that. And that really wasn't the sticking point for Nintendo, but the contract did not explicitly prevent Sony from using its partnership to launch its own system independent of Nintendo. And when Nintendo started hearing words that Ken Kutaragi was actually going to do it anyways, that the PlayStation was going to happen regardless of the partnership with Nintendo, it was one of those things that Nintendo's like, look, we can't use our IPs to promote a Sony product that's ultimately going to lead to them branching out on their own with some IP rights to our stuff. Essentially, if Nintendo had stayed in that partnership, Sony could have used their IPs on the PlayStation for various things like music and movies, and ultimately that could have massively damaged the Nintendo brand and ultimately led Nintendo down the route of Sega. So Nintendo was kind of left in a situation where they didn't have a lot of options. Now, Nintendo didn't need to approach it the way they did. They could have tried to get out of the contract without making a public ordeal and trying to embarrass Sony. But clearly, Nintendo felt like Sony was trying to embarrass Nintendo, and within a few years would have made Nintendo look like a laughingstock, having made the worst business deal in the history of gaming. If Nintendo did not back out of that contract, we would be talking about how it was the worst deal for Nintendo ever. Remember, the common thought process is if Nintendo didn't back out, imagine where they could be today with Sony and Nintendo being partnered. But Sony was never actually acting in good faith on that contract. They were proud of that partnership at the time, with Nintendo being the leader in the home console space, but they had always planned to launch their own platform. Now, Nintendo breaking contracts sped up the process of them launching their own platform. Certainly, there's no denying that, but still, it's really interesting to see that Nintendo kind of felt that there was not good faith acting on Sony's side, that the contract was extremely one-sided, and all Nintendo was getting out of it was a CD player. And they didn't like that that was all they got, that they couldn't retain their IP rights. And Nintendo at the time, at the top of the console mountain, with some of the most highly coveted IPs in the industry, was obviously not very happy to find out that after making an agreement that involved some of the IP rights, that Sony might be using that to end up boosting their own system down the line. So it's not like Sony is completely innocent here. It's not like the story, when it's spread around the internet, the common misconception is that Sony did nothing wrong. And that's not true. Sony made that contract in not in good faith. And there are certain situations where a contract like that, especially in the United States, would be considered null and void. If you make a contract that's not in good faith, that is long haul looking to harm the brand you are making that contract with, sometimes those contracts in the Court of Appeals is looked at as null and void. So Nintendo, if you remember from the fallout from this, there wasn't like some giant lawsuit from Sony's side on this. I think this is lost in all of this, that they had this agreement in place, they had this contract, they had the papers, but reality is that there wasn't a massive multi-billion-dollar lawsuit here. It just kind of went away. And it went away because it wasn't a good faith contract. And because it wasn't a good faith contract, there really wasn't a lawsuit to pursue on Sony's end. So at the end of the day, both companies were actually in the wrong. Nintendo was in the wrong for basically two primary reasons. One, publicly embarrassing Sony. That probably didn't need to happen. Nintendo could have took care of this behind the scenes and quietly had the contract canceled and been done with it. They didn't need to make a big public ordeal out of it. But obviously Nintendo felt like they were being slighted behind the scenes, so they wanted to strike first publicly. And obviously we know that kind of backfired, because that ended up boosting Sony's reputation and boosting Sony's next debut system. So it ended up not being a smart move by Nintendo, and it's probably something that they look back on and think, we probably shouldn't have did that. And plus, we all know the Philips CDI, the 3DO platforms, like those, they sucked. Like, it was horrible. It was a terrible partnership, and Nintendo would have been better off not making a partnership with anyone and just doing their own thing, which they ended up doing anyways with the N64. Now, beyond all of that mess of things, and obviously, I'm not saying that this is why PlayStation was successful. Sony did a lot better deals with third-party developers, and they really wanted to work with their platform, plus the CD format could hold way more data. So, again, there's a lot of reasons that third parties started shifting to PlayStation. Nintendo is not exactly innocent in that front of things. The other mistake Nintendo made was when this contract was initially being made with Sony, they didn't negotiate better terms. I think what happened at that time is Nintendo had not actually been in the electronic video game business for very long. Okay, they had entered it into the 80s with arcade cabinets, and actually there's a console that's older than the NES that Nintendo was involved in, but the reality is that Nintendo was kind of new to the whole consumer electronics space, whereas Sony was a behemoth. Sony was like the top dog in consumer electronics. If you wanted to partner with anyone for consumer electronic reasons, you partnered with Sony. And Nintendo basically bowed down to the king of electronics when they made that contract. Nintendo basically did not value themselves at an appropriate level in contract negotiations with Sony, and that didn't really come to their minds and realize it till the rumors started spreading about how Ken Kutaragi was going to push Sony to make its own platform anyways, and how the contract they had in place didn't explicitly block Sony from doing just that. There was nothing that made it so Sony could only exclusively make video game related hardware with Nintendo. That is a term that should have been put into the contract. Nintendo should have valued their IPs at a much higher stake than they actually did. And unfortunately, Nintendo didn't negotiate with those two mindsets. They negotiated with Sony's the biggest name in consumer electronics. We want to be partnered with them. We're going to give in to Sony's demands. And that was ultimately a mistake on Nintendo's part as well. A much bigger mistake than quote unquote, betraying Sony by basically publicly announcing they are canceling the contract. So I honestly think that this is a whole mess of a situation, but it's one that ultimately was a good decision for Nintendo, at least in terms of just canceling the partnership altogether. After they screwed up in negotiating the terms of that contract, Nintendo was really put in a situation where the best move for them was to back out. They probably shouldn't have publicly shamed them. They should have never partnered with Philips. But it is what it is. Revisionist history, there's a lot of it that exists out there, and maybe that's why I'm making this video. A lot of people that I talk to about this situation seem to have their own versions of it, and they don't look at the entire facts of the situation. Reality is Sony's not innocent in all of this, and that's really what I wanted to draw attention to. I'm not saying that Nintendo should have did what they did, and I'm not saying Nintendo is entirely at fault in terms of not negotiating a contract that should have benefited them more. But reality is that Sony did not act in good faith on their contract and was probably looking to backstab Nintendo the entire time. It just wasn't going to happen in such a public fashion for many, many years. So whatever, it is what it is. Ultimately, I think the video game industry has been better off for all of this in the end. Look at where the Switch is today. Look at what we got with Nintendo Wii. That might have never happened if they would have stayed partners and Sony didn't make their own system. Look at all the people that are super happy with PlayStation and some of the advancements PlayStation has done. You got PlayStation VR and all that. There's all these things that have happened that you don't know if they would exist in today's gaming landscape if the two companies didn't part ways. But I ultimately think everyone has kind of basically benefited from this. So I honestly think it ended up being a positive thing for gaming, even if at the time Sony felt slighted and Nintendo felt like they were about to be backstabbed. Anyways, thank you guys so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this kind of quick look at the history between that situation. Again, be sure to go check out that book. The book provides a whole bunch of sources on all of this information, a whole bunch of cited quotes and interviews and legal documents and all that stuff to back up everything that it says. I want to thank you guys for tuning in, and you know what? I'll catch you guys in the next video.